All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your patience. Um, Today's talk is about empowering AI innovation, the critical role of open source, and navigating the future together. My name is Frank Vigne. I'm an AI MVP. You can catch me at the following URLs, and feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Since I did lose some time to connectivity issues, I'll make some of this stuff extra quick. At my day job, I'm the global go-to-market lead for Red Hat OpenShift AI. And you may be thinking, like, Red Hat? You mean the open source Linux people? Yes. I also have a podcast. We're in the early stages of planning season 8. We have about 358 shows already out there. And now we have a video solution now where you can actually watch some of the recordings. I'll make sure that the slides get shared. One of the things I like to do is like to take a step back and think holistically about the data science and AI in general, right? AI itself is really sitting on top of a much larger pyramid, and with apologies to Abraham Maslow, who created the hierarchy of human needs, that AI really is a function of how good your data science practice is. Your data science practice is only as good as your services that you have, our DBMSs, data lakes, et cetera. They themselves are reliant on storage, hardware, and networking. And security is something I think we need to think about across the entire spectrum of what an entire platform. And we're at a critical juncture for humanity here because of the ethical concerns that we're building. You may have heard this called the fourth industrial revolution, and all sorts of other superlative talk. But I would say that the real key here is we are designing the future for probably the next century. And who knows what's going to happen after that. And if you've seen in the news, there's no shortage of controversy when it comes to AI. Elon Musk has sued OpenAI for their breaches of contract. Google had some interesting controversies about their AI generation. And in a more serious note, there's a really horrible story out of Texas where a faulty facial recognition algorithm, basically they claimed that this guy had robbed a store, and the guy was either in jail out of state and like in the other part of the country, or in the hospital. So either way, he had real proof that, hey, I was not in Texas when this happened. And it's pretty amazing. So it makes you wonder, like, hey, how are these models trained? And if you're familiar with AI, you're familiar with data science, like, you know, the general thing, right? Data training model. How was the data trained on the models that we use every day, right? I don't know. Do you know? How was it trained? What data was used? What's the output of the model? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine, right? This is a problem, right? And why is it a problem? Well, let's start with the big ones, right? Ethics, right? Wrongful arrest. Even if there are facial recognition brings up a whole other conversation about the ethical uses of that, and you can see kind of you don't have to look very far to find some concerns about that. But what if the model's wrong? This guy in particular had a very provable reason that, hey man, I was on the West Coast when this happened, right? I was far away. I could do this. There's also fairness, right? Are there any biases that are in there? Accuracy, the accuracy kind of already covered. Privacy, right? What types of data was used, right? What about the safety, right? We're looking at a world where AI is going to drive our cars, recommend us for jobs, right? How do we control that? How do we control that? And let's be real. I mean, it's not a stretch of the imagination to assume that somebody somewhere is planning to have a weapon system that will be 100% self automated, right? I would like to think that that's not going to happen, but that would be naive. So let's talk about open source. And you're probably thinking, Frank, you work at Red Hat, man. You're obviously you're into open source. Um, and I myself came to open source in kind of a roundabout kind of way, right? I started my career, not being a fan of open source. I joined Microsoft for a number of times, and I worked for Microsoft under Steve Ballmer, who was definitely not a fan of open source, and under Satya Nadella, who is more of a fan of open source. And now I find myself kind of in a company that is known for commercializing open source. I have really become a true believer in this, in that, you get a certain level of transparency with open source. There's an inherent collaboration. It's it's kind of early here in DC. Then all of that kind of the transparency, the collaboration leads to a sense of trust. That sense of trust also leads to innovation, which innovation in itself leads to a lot of flexibility. And also, you can't understate the ability to educate this, right? When I started my career doing Visual Basic 3 development, right? There was not a lot of underlying exploration of the underlying engine of how that was built. But now you can literally step into, even in .NET, you can step into the actual libraries, the actual DLLs that Microsoft made. I think that is enormous for not just debugging things, but just education, just understanding how these things are put together at the lowest levels. And I think that open source just implicitly means you get a community with it, right? It's a bunch of humans. I'm listening here. It's a bots working together. And because of the nature of the internet, this could be a global type of event. We also have the ability to think about the shared accountability, right? Because we are building systems that will impact our livelihoods, our physical safety, arguably our psychological safety too. There needs to be some kind of accountability, right? Because when a human makes a bad decision, and just look at history or your personal life, human, natural neural networks, natural intelligence makes some pretty terrible decisions from time to time. But you can always kind of chalk that up to, well, that's person, right? That person is accountable for making that decision. When it comes to getting this done at a machine level, I don't think we're quite ready there to do that, right? So just about the idea of who's accountable for it, right? The old question that I had heard was, if a driverless car crashes into a person and somebody gets killed, who's at fault? Is it the driver of the car? I mean, probably, I don't know. Like current laws, at least in the United States, would pin the blame on the driver who was operating the vehicle. But if the driver's not operating the vehicle, is it the software engineer? Is it the company that built it? Right? All these questions have really been largely unanswered because this is still relatively new. And I think that there's already been a symbiotic. The good news is that there's already a good relationship between AI development and innovation and open source. We're most of the way there in a lot of ways. This is a screenshot of Attention is All You Need, which was actually put out by Google. I want to say 2017. The timestamp on the paper said that it was updated in 2023. But the idea is that Google had kind of come with this notion of attention in a convolutional neural network and transformers would really be the key to unlocking new levels of innovation and intelligence. And this, of course, we see every day now. We use it with whether you're using Gemini, Bard, whatever it's called this week, or OpenAI. This is definitely has become crucial towards a lot of this. And you could go and download this paper on Archive right now. But most of the research accordingly is publicly available. And that's great. That's great for innovation. It's great for the industry. It's great for education, and it's great for collaboration. And if you think about it, you take a step back and think, hey, most of the tooling in AI development is open source anyway, right? I'm talking about TensorFlow, PyTorch, even the very languages themselves, Python and R, all have an open source origin story. Obviously, Spark, Git, Linux, right? Spark and Ray, all open source. So, all of that in mind, what would an ideal open AI look like? And I want to point out when I say open AI, there's a space there because unlike the name, open AI is not very well open. And I'll try to run through these really quick because I want to leave room for questions. But I think it really consists of four components, right? Open source, open access, open data, and open weights. Open weights is a relatively new term, and we'll get to that last. Open source, I think by now, when even Microsoft has embraced open source, I think it's gone mainstream. Microsoft has become a real champion of open source technology, but this is basically refers to software or models where source code is available for the public to use, modify, and distribute. Now, I know there's different details and licenses and whatnot, but the whole idea here is that you can just view the source, take a look at what's going on under the hood, or under the bonnet, I guess, depending on where you are in the world. Um, this promotes transparency, innovation, and collaboration because if I don't like how a feature is particularly implemented, I could go in, modify it, and then I have immediate use of it. Or I can go and I can submit a request, a pull request, and that can be integrated into the product. Open access. Open access, I think this is where right now we're in a really good position here in the AI world, where the research papers and methodologies are made available to the public. And this really facilitates a lot of advancement and knowledge sharing in the field. I think going back to AlexNet, which is 11 years ago, wow, um, where that was kind of this moment where they published their research and how they built the neural networks and how they did the training. Open data, I think, is also another area where things are going really well that speak very well to this. Um, Data sets are a lot of data sets are made freely. In many cases, government agencies have kind of opened up a lot of their data sources. In the United States, there's data.gov. New York City also has an open data set where you can download how many parking violations there've been, and you can map that onto a map of the city and see, are there any patterns there? There's plenty of work has been done with this. If I'm sure you're familiar with Kaggle, where you have teams of people working through data science problems, all to win a prize. And even if that prize is, say $1 million, that prize, if you're from the company's point of view, whoever's sponsoring that competition, it's a real win because they can very cheaply get a lot of brilliant minds working on a problem, competing not just for the cash, but also for the prestige of being a Kaggle winner. Um, and I think open data is really crucial because if you think about the earlier slide where data is really the foundation of AI, and this is critical for training these, right? And going through here. Open weights. This is something that's fairly new, a fairly new concept in this space. And that is that the idea is that you don't share the methodologies per se. You don't, well, you don't share the data. And again, this is a very new type of term with some new um, so I think when I say open weights and somebody else says open weights, they may have different definitions. There's no standard definition just yet. But the idea is that when you create a neural network, or you train a neural network, you get what they call weights and bias, right? And these are effectively, well, integers. I mean, at the end of the day, these are numbers. And what this means is that I can expose my model and you can look at the weights in the models. Now, could you reproduce it? Possibly somebody really smart with could do that. But it's a way of that I can, let's just say I'm a large social network company, and I have tons of data on all these users. And I've discovered certain patterns, language patterns, and certain demographics used. I can have an LLM that's trained on those models and trained on that language patterns and whatnot. And I can expose that model without exposing the underlying data that went into it, which is to say, I can expose the actual structure of the neural network and the actual neural network for people to explore and even customize to a certain extent by doing some fine tuning. But ultimately, what this really does is that I can protect my data sources and I can also protect my intellectual property because I may have spent millions of dollars training that model and I may want to monetize that model. How do I do that in a way that I can protect my intellectual property, but still make it a lot more transparent about how this goes? I think this is going to be um, an area of interest and concern because it's kind of a compromise, right? If you get back to where, how was this model trained? What data was it used? We still don't have that answer, but we do at least have some understanding of how the model may work, and we have some insight into it. And if you go back to that slide, to which you're wondering, Frank, what are you talking about? I mean this, right? Um, we don't, in that case, an open weight, well, we don't really have all the information on the data that was used. We do have some understanding how the model functions, right? We don't really have a lot of insight into how it was trained, but we do at least have one of the three elements that are available. And I think that when you consider the extreme cost right now of training these models, I think this is a fairly reasonable compromise. I may change my mind on this later, but for now, I think it's a fairly reasonable compromise because if I spent, let's just throw out a number, $100 million. I don't have $100 million, but if I had a company and I were in that position of spending $100 million, I would be very reluctant on sharing all of my secrets. And I think that's relatively fair because open weights, you at least have the option of exploring kind of how things will work. It's better than nothing. And I know that's a really kind of pessimistic way to phrase it. But for the most part, I would say that that's fairly reasonable. Now, because I can understand why companies would be very hesitant to just open up everything. And open source itself does not mean we open up everything. Pick any open source project that became a commercial product. There's a lot of stuff that's just different in the downstream version that is proprietary, right? It has an open source common ancestor upstream, but it's not all kind of free and given out just for fun. Now, the final part here is that and I think security research on this is still ongoing, and I think it's still too early to say one way or the other. Um, is the idea that this can potentially make it easier to remove or bypass built-in safeguards, raising concerns about misuse or ethical implications. I think this is still very much a moving target, as they say, and I think it's still pretty too soon to say is that going to be a big problem or a minor problem. Um, Speaking of ethics, it's time to talk about ethics. And it's one of those things where um, I've been in the industry for a while. My degree is in computer science. They never ethics kind of came up, but that was part of a philosophy class that had nothing to do with my degree. I just had to take it. But in all of my time as a software engineer, ethics really only came up once or twice. In my time in being in data science and AI, it comes up at least once a week now. At one point, it was like once a month. Now it's about once a week that the conversation of how is this done ethically does at least come up. And I do realize I'm rushing through this because I want to make sure that I leave room time for questions and whatnot. But I think that while ethics means something different to everyone to a certain degree, I think we need to be very conscious of that we are making the future now. We are setting the tone for the remainder of the century. And let's make sure it's a future we want to live in and that we want our kids to live in. I have three kids, and I do wonder, um, the traditional path of go to school, get a good job, get a good education, get a good job, and you'll you work for one company for a number of years. That's not quite as not like what my parents had. And I look at what the whole learn to code movement, and one of my kids does know how to code, and I wonder like, well, is coding even going to be a career in 5 years, let alone when he gets out of school? So I don't know. I think it's important to kind of think about that and think about not just what we're doing today for the sake of what we're doing and what we're trying to figure out, but think one or two moves out, just like in chess. And I think this is really where I think open source excels, because open source provides a baseline of transparency. Um, I'll pick on OpenAI because one, they deserve to be picked on, and two, they're the biggest kid in the block, and I don't think Sam Altman's feelings will be hurt because he seems like a pretty tough guy. Um, we don't know how that was trained. We have very little information. We only have rumors of how much it cost or how many, what types of data went into it. In fact, there's been a number of lawsuits about that. I know the New York Times recently filed a lawsuit because their data was used. Twitter data was used. I noticed things that I've written have been used in that training. I never gave consent to that. So I find that interesting. Who made the decision to pick the training data? What is the training data? We don't really know. But open source provides a baseline of transparency, and transparency generally leads to better accountability, right? Because you can see why was that decision made, who made it, and what was the rationale to that. And because of accountability, people tend to be on their better behavior. Right? People will tend to, if they're held accountable for their decisions, will tend to make better choices. And better choices leads to a better outcome. Now, look, I'm not naive. I'm not saying that, hey, if we open source all the things, everything will be wonderful. There'll be kittens and rainbows and unicorns flying around. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that when you have an open source project, you get a baseline of transparency you don't get in any other way. And I say this as someone who, I worked on, Adobe Flash and Silverlight, right? There was no open source there. There was no accountability. And when it died, it just died. Whereas if you look at other open source projects, when there was kind of a rift between the organizers and the community, they usually worked it out because they kind of had to. I'm thinking about Node.js in particular, because there was some frustration with the community, I think about 10, 11 years ago, where the community said, a bunch of people in the community said, we're just going to make our own. We're going to take the open source that you have, and we're going to create our own separate project. I think it was called IOJS. That caused the Node Foundation to kind of stop and realize that we should work together. All that being said, I think that, and this is a quote that's attributed to either Peter Drucker or Abraham Lincoln, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think that we are in a field that is so new. We're still new. We are still in the early days of the AI revolution. I remember the dot-com boom. I would say we're still pretty early on into that. And I think the best way to predict the future is to create it, but make sure it's a future that we want our kids to live in. And with that, I will say thank you. And let me know if you have any questions. That's QR code will take you to my LinkedIn profile. I will accept that. And I am ready for questions if there's any.
Let me check for the questions here.
Yeah, sure. And I want to thank everyone for their patience for my technical glitch.
So I haven't seen any questions posted here, but
Okay.
how you feel? How's your personal? The session was very informative,
Oh,
and
thank you.
everything, especially for today's need. Earlier, last night, I was just looking to the news, the tweets between Elon Musk and on that piece which you mentioned, that in the suing the Microsoft and Altman. So what's your opinion on this? That how this you might have seen Sora is also coming for the video
Mhm.
generation. So how things gonna change, work in the future? Because if in one case we
Yeah,
are getting the advantages of AI, but on the other hand we also have the misuse. You also mentioned about that.
absolutely. And like, how would you know? So somebody posted something the other day. I happened to see it. It was like a YouTube short or whatever. And somebody had used, they made it look like a meteor had crashed into off the coast of the water. And I was like, oh my God, why didn't this make the news? And I looked at it, I'm like, wait a minute. This is totally, I mean, if you think about it, going back to Jurassic Park, when that movie came out, they
Yeah.
made it look like dinosaurs were walking around. So I think that this has been a long time coming. You really can't trust what you see. And for a really long time, you've never really been able to trust what you can read either. But that's a whole other story. There's an old saying, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. The the musician Pitbull turned that into a song. So, but I would say that we need to be very mindful that, just because it looks real doesn't mean it is real. And when we interact with the world through video screens, anything
Yeah.
on a video screen could be imitated. Now, here's the thing: in the 1990s, you had to be Steven Spielberg to create something that looked real that wasn't real. Now with Sora, I mean, you just have to be able to type a sentence, right? And you can even do that now. Like if you've seen Pika.ai, I've made stuff. I've taken still images and turned them into little movie clips. And do they look perfect? No, but they look close enough that, one of the things in Sora when they did the demo video is that they kind of show the people, and you could kind of tell with the hands the guy had like 10 fingers on one hand. So there's still kind of things you can do, but no, you're absolutely right. And it's not hard to imagine that being used for ill purposes. Deep fakes have been around for a few years.
Yeah.
I think that
I was
it,
asking about that.
yeah, and I would say deep fakes are one of those things where I think that depending on what is deep faked, is going to determine that. But I think we need to. I think over time, people are going to be less trusting of what they see. I think we're still at that point where, well, I see it, so it must be real. And there was a time when people would say, like, "Oh, it's on the internet; it must be true," right? Um,
Yeah.
I think, I think society will evolve to be very skeptical of it, which, you know, and the whole thing where if you're trying to prevent unethical use, which a lot of the safeguards that are in place.
But, but there's so much misusage of the technology these days, especially on the social platforms for gaining views, creating content. I think we lost you, Frank. I think we lost Frank here. Saad, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'm here. I thought that I'm not so. So, guys, you have the contact details of Frank already shared, and this session will be uploaded to the YouTube on Tech Day Pakistan YouTube channel. And from here, we will wait for our next session, which is going to start in 15 minutes, and we will join you back shortly. Thank you till that time.
All right, are you there?
Yeah, actually, we lost you for some time.
Yeah,
So,
for some reason my internet cut out, so sorry about that.
no, that's
But
fine.
I think it's important to think about this in a sensible way, right? There's a lot of voices saying we need to stop this, we need to block this. It's not stopping, it's not going away. We need to learn how to live with AI, and the best way to live with AI is to be more insistent on transparency. Um,
Yeah,
you know, OpenAI
actually,
is open in name only. yet we're all rushing to use it, right? We need to, as customers, we need to demand more transparency from them.
Actually, I have seen because we have been exploring Copilot these days and have seen a very aggressive usage and also the productive usage of Copilots. They're using the OpenAI ChatGPT at the back end and how they are transforming with the help of the generative AI, the information which are on which we are getting. So it's not only for the organization, also for the tech persons and users. It's giving them a new platform to get started from anywhere. Earlier, I also have been given a session on that. If you do not have any idea that what you want to do, you just express yourself. That's what you are looking for. Because sometimes it happens that a beginner do not know the starting point of creating an application. But these platforms are giving you the opportunity to get what you are looking for, and you will understand what are the consequences or what are the things which you are looking to generate you for your application. So each platform has its own cons and also the benefits.
Yeah,
But
and I
it's
think
all
Microsoft is very smart. I'm sorry, I cut you off. They just announced a relationship with not Mistrial, but whatever the European-based LLM company is, Mixtrio, because I think it's important for a company as big and as important as Microsoft to rely on more than one AI vendor. I think that's important for their shareholders, their business, their users, because I mean, we saw, I'm not picking on OpenAI, but we saw that everything was fine, and then over the weekend the board decided to fire Sam Altman. And then for the next 7 days, everybody's
actually,
like, what is going on?
That was a
Like,
crazy week.
it was a busy week, and it's just like, I think it was if we walk away with the lesson of don't rely on one company to provide you all of your AI solutions, right? And I think, I don't want to speak for Microsoft, I don't work there anymore, but I'm sure that was a wake-up call for a lot of
Totally
people,
agree.
like that, like, wait a minute, like, we've invested billions of dollars in this, and we have no idea what's going on inside that company, what's going on. So I think it's important for them to have more than one vendor, because I think it makes sense. I'm also the believer in that the idea of having one language model to do everything, I don't think is really practical. I think if we have language models that are specifically dedicated to, say, medical usage or legal usage or this, I think that those are going to be the hyper trained, the super trained on one domain are going to be better at their at the processes than ones that are kind of just generically trained on all things. I like to say the example of, do you want to go to a doctor, to a cardiologist that is a cardiologist and an accountant? You probably wouldn't feel comfortable in that, right? Because you'd want somebody that devoted their lives to cardiology or to accounting. Now, I'm sure across 8 billion people in the world, thereabouts, there's somebody, maybe a few somebodies that are really good at both. But those are going to be rare.
Yeah.
And I know we're out of time.
So good, and thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you.
I mentioned earlier that the session recordings will be uploaded to the YouTube channel of Tech Day Pakistan. And anyone, if they miss it, anything, they can listen to this session there. And if you want to reach out to Frank, the information will be there. Thank you so much, Frank, for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your patience.